and I in them. The crowd said, "This is a hard teaching. Who can accept it?" In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. In our gospel lesson this morning, we see Jesus drawing a crowd. That's kind of the thing he does, you know. His sermons are unforgettable. His miracles unbelievable. People tell their friends about it. They follow him wherever he goes. They love how Jesus sticks up for the underdogs. They love how he speaks truth to power. He's got an undeniable magnetism. Who wouldn't want to follow somebody like this, yes? But Jesus is going to do something today. In fact, he's going to say something today that challenges his followers. And by challenge, I mean he really freaks them out. And his followers are going to have a choice to make. This is getting a bit strange. Are we in or are we out? And the main theme this morning, the main thing that we need to understand, is that followers of Jesus today will also be confronted by this choice. Are we in or are we out? Because Jesus has some difficult things to say. And when Jesus says hard things, how will we respond? So let's dive into the text. If you're the type that likes to follow along, we'll be in the Gospel from St. John, found in the bulletin in front of you, or in the Pew Bible. The crowd is gathered. They're ready for a miracle or two. Maybe a clever speech, or at least something interesting for their next cocktail party. But what Jesus actually says stops them in their tracks. If you really want to live in me, and have me live in you, you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood. Can you imagine the crowd's reaction? Jesus, we understand that you're a prophet. We get that prophets sometimes say and do weird things, but what do you mean eat your flesh and drink your blood? Now, for Christians in the here and now at St. Matthew's Cathedral, who celebrate the Eucharist at least once a week, this language about eating and drinking Jesus is the most normal thing in the world. We don't think twice about it. But this language stopped Jesus' earliest followers in their tracks. That'll make a little bit more sense if we talk a bit about the historical background. The law of Moses, in several places, specifically forbade eating or drinking blood. Not just because that's a gross thing to do, but because of the theological understanding of what blood is when we talk about animals and sacrifice. Blood was seen as the life force of the animal and the means by which atonement or reconciliation with God would occur. So, the blood of a sacrificial animal, when offered to God, had a cleansing function that was designed to wash away sins, like a sort of liturgical Clorox. You wouldn't consume the blood. It was designed to make you clean. I know that explanation doesn't produce in us the same sort of visceral disgust that the disciples felt, but at least now you have some context for the situation. With that context in mind, let's jump back in. Jesus says, "Just like the living Father sent me, and I live because of him, so whoever eats me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven, not like the kind your ancestors ate. The one who eats this bread will live forever." His followers are stumped. They're more than stumped, they're offended. They're downright angry. And so they ask one of the most crucial questions in all of the scriptures. And I really do mean that, one of the most crucial questions. When many of his disciples heard this, perhaps through gritted teeth and clenched fist, they asked, "This teaching is difficult. Who can believe it? This is a hard saying. Who can accept it?" We know that early Christians were accused by the wider culture of cannibalism even centuries after this episode. Clearly, Jesus' word had a hard time being understood. Jesus, of course, wasn't promoting cannibalism. He was beginning to unpack the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist. But for the people to get that through their heads, they would have had had to stick around to ask questions, to go a little deeper. Jesus can tell that his statements have gotten under their skin. He knows they're grumbling, they're murmuring about it. And so he asks them something back that's pretty straightforward, cutting right to the heart of the matter. And I imagine he asks the question seriously, soberly, getting them to really count the cost. He says, "Does this offend you? If it does, what if you were to see me ascending to where I was before? In other words, if you're offended when I say I'm the bread that came down from heaven, will you also be offended when I go back up there? Because that's happening. The words that I've spoken to you are spirit and life, but among you there are some who do not believe." And then a really terrible, sad thing happens. Because of this, because of what Jesus said, many of his disciples, not some, not a handful, but many of his followers turned back and no longer went with him. Because of what he said, many of his followers were followers no longer. If Jesus had a public relations team, can you imagine them trying to get a spin on this one? A PR team scrambling to get their heads around the situation. Doesn't Jesus know that dogma or doctrine isn't really what it's all about? Doesn't Jesus know that there are lots of ways up the mountain of spirituality? Doesn't Jesus realize that people might think he's unwelcoming, doctrinaire, rigid? Doesn't he know religion shouldn't exclude people? It's the year 30 AD after all. Because of what Jesus said, many of his disciples turned back and went their separate ways. And friends, one thing we need to reckon with this morning is that we don't know who these people were. We don't know how many abandoned Jesus here, and though hopefully they aren't lost unto salvation, they are certainly now lost to history. Can I be really honest with you here? There are at least 3 groups of people in the room today. There are certainly more, but there are at least 3. There are some of us who have been here for years, or maybe we've self-identified as a Christian more or less our entire lives, and yet at the end of the day, we really don't believe a word of what Jesus says. And maybe we're even fond of Jesus as a historical figure, but we certainly don't think any of this matters or has any real bearing on our day-to-day 9-to-5 lives. You don't have any of the moral courage to live a life that is radically distinct from the world around you. If your friends or co-workers had to guess whether or not you were a Christian, they'd have no idea how to answer. Sure, maybe you show up here once in a while when convenient. Maybe you throw some cash in the plate. But ultimately, when you hear the word of Jesus speaking to you today, your response is just to shrug your shoulders. You're apathetic, lukewarm. Gosh, that sounds hard, you think. I'll just pretend like I don't know what's going on. Yeah, I don't know about all of that Jesus is the only way stuff. I just know I'm supposed to be nice to people. My friends, if that's you today, let me be quite clear, you probably would have left Jesus after this speech. Why would you stay? Clearly being a Christian is costly. Clearly it requires you to live differently. It's easier just to play golf on Sunday mornings, isn't it? It's easier to wake up late with a latte in the paper. If that's you this morning and Jesus says something that's designed to shake you to your core, calling into question your whole devotion, what in the world makes you think you would have stuck around? But there are at least 2 other groups in the room. Firstly, we also need to say that there are some of you here who aren't in that first group at all. There are some here who've made baptismal promises and meant them. Do you renounce Satan and all forces of wickedness that rebel against God and corrupt and destroy his creatures? I renounce them, they said, and they meant it. Do you turn to Christ and accept him as your Savior, putting your whole trust in his grace and love, promising to follow and obey him as your Lord? These said, I do, and they meant it. And then there's at least one final group. Maybe you're just checking out Jesus for the first time. Maybe you're really interested in religion broadly or Christianity in particular, and you're here today and you're curious. You know that life needs a bigger ism to make sense of all of it. You know that capitalism and materialism and sentimentality and even spirituality are insufficient guides for your life, and you're looking for something. Whichever of those three groups you belong to today, I want you to listen in on what happens next. When Jesus says hard things, how will we respond? The crowds are gone. The fair weather fans have left the stadium at halftime. So Jesus pulls the 12 disciples close, and maybe there really were only 12 left. Do you also wish to go away too? Are you going to leave me also? And then the response comes back from probably the most unlikely creature imaginable, Simon Peter. He answers, "We've come to believe and know that you're the Holy One of God. You have the words of everlasting life. Lord, where else will we go? To whom else can we go?" The crowds that followed Jesus that day have the same decision to make that you and I and everyone else will have to make eventually. Jesus has an undeniable magnetism about him. He really draws you in. And if you follow Jesus for long enough, he's going to say some things that shock and offend you. And you'll have a choice to make. But first you need to understand that Jesus isn't like your uncle's favorite cable news pundit. You know, that person whose only goal in life is to offend others with their opinions, as if being offensive were an end in itself. Jesus doesn't offend us in order to get more customers or to get more airtime. As you can see from the text, that's not really an effective way to build your brand. Jesus does this to give us a wake-up call. He does it because he loves us, and he loves us enough to tell us the truth. There can be no love without the truth. It's almost like an intervention. Have you ever been part of an intervention? If you have, you know that sometimes the truth hurts, and it sets us free if we'll accept it. It'll set us free to live the true and better life God always wanted for us, if we'll accept it. It'll cost us something. Flannery O'Connor, the famous novelist who deserves a sermon series all her own, perhaps, once said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you odd." Gloria Steinem once said, "The truth will set you free, but it'll piss you off first." Beloved, understand that Jesus' words are not offensive, as if getting under our skin were an end in itself. His words are not offensive for offense's sake, but neither are they pious opinions nor good advice. They are in fact the words of life. To whom else shall we go? The crowds that day, you and I, and everybody else are today confronted with the same decision. Jesus has drawn us here to this place and time. And if you follow him for a while, the searing light of his truth and his gospel are going to expose some parts of your life that you prefer not be seen. If you follow him, sometimes it's going to feel like purification, like winnowing, like sifting, like fire. And you'll have a choice to make. And when that choice is presented to you, know this: the choice is itself an invitation from Jesus to go deeper. Deeper into the light and love of God. Further up and further in. Further into what Pseudo-Dionysius called the wisdom of heaven, that God will lead us up to the farthest, highest peak of mystic scripture, where the mysteries of his word lie simple, absolute, unchangeable in the brilliant darkness of a hidden silence. Amidst the deepest shadow they pour overwhelming light on what is most manifest. Amid the holy, unsensed, and unseen, they completely fill our sightless minds with treasures beyond all beauty. And that's just one holy dude trying his best to get you to understand what Jesus offers you. trying his best to explain what union with God is like, trying to get us to see the kind of adventure that is the Christian journey. It's okay not to have all the answers. It's okay to be puzzled or stumped or even offended by Jesus sometimes. It really is. In fact, we should expect it. If Jesus has never shaken you up before, you really just haven't been paying attention. It's okay to feel that way. The response is what matters. One of St. Anselm's great gifts to the church was the phrase, faith seeking understanding. Notice which comes first. Faith seeking understanding, that is, cognition which follows belief. In other words, following Jesus is a requirement for figuring out what he's up to in the world. Spectating won't get us very far at all. The decision is ahead. He's drawn all of us here. And when Jesus says hard things, we have a choice to make. That of the crowds or that of Peter. Peter said, Lord, where else can we go? You alone have the life-giving words. If it's not too obvious to say, my pastoral prayer for you, regardless of which group you belong to today, is that you stick with this thing long enough such that Peter's words can truly become yours. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.